Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to tackle a beginner React project, which is going to teach you everything you need to know about props, state management, and hooks in React. So this is a great project to get started on. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to my channel for more videos just like this one. Now to get started, I have the finished version of our product over on the right-hand side of our screen, and on the left, I have the basic implementation of Create React App. And to get all of this code, all you need to do is create a folder that has no uppercase and no spaces in it, and then you run the command npx create react app with a period at the end, and that'll create all of these files that you see on the left-hand side here inside of your folder. And if you get an error, for example, that says npx not defined, just make sure that you update npm, because that's how you are able to use npx. And this takes a little bit to run, which is why I did it to begin with. And now the first thing that I want to do is to remove all the files that we don't need. For example, we have a bunch of files in our source and in our public folder that we're never going to actually use. The public folder we can just leave as is for now, that's fine. But inside of our source, let's remove all these extra files for testing, for example. We're not going to worry about that. We don't need this logo, that's the React logo. We don't need a service worker, and we don't need to set up our test. So let's delete all of those. And then inside this index.js, we got rid of the service worker. So we'll get rid of this service worker code. We also can get rid of this import for the service worker and this CSS file here, which we deleted. All we want is this single render for our app. Then in the app.css, let's just remove all of the CSS. We don't want anything in there. And in our app.js, we can get rid of this logo since we're no longer importing that logo. We can also get rid of all of this HTML in our return. And we're just going to write out our own H1 that just says hello world. And now if we run our application by running npm start, it's going to take a little bit to start up, but then you can see over here, our application is going to open up and we should have a single H1 that says hello world inside of our application. And once that finishes loading, you can see we get a single H1 that says hello world. And if we change our CSS in here to make our body have a background color of red, for example, you can see that translates over into our actual application. So our CSS is hooked up to our application. Our HTML we can load in here inside of our app component, and it'll render inside of our web browser. So this means that we have everything we need done so that we can actually start building the currency conversion app that we want to build. And I have this app right over here. I'm going to kind of show you how it works first, and then we can work on building it. So we have different dropdowns where we can select the currencies that we want to use. And then inside of these boxes, we can change one currency and it'll update the other one. So if we wanted 2 euros converted to Canadian dollars, you can see that'd be 2.9 Canadian dollars. And we can change it to 3, 4, 5, and that works perfectly. And if we change a Canadian number to 7, for example, you can see that's 4.8 euros. And we can change euros to something, and everything is going to update perfectly no matter what we change, which is really, really important. So to get started with this HTML, the first thing we need to do in our app is we want our title here to say convert instead of hello world. And then we're going to want to have a row for this currency conversion and a row for this currency conversion. But we're actually going to create separate components for those because as you can see, these rows are exactly the same. So we can create a single component for each one. So we can create a file. We're just going to call this here currency row.js. .js. And inside of here, if you have the extension called EF6 snippets, you can just type RFC and hit enter and it'll generate all this code for you. And you can get this extension, it's just right here, ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native snippets. I love this for creating React apps, it makes it so much easier, but you can also just type all this out, it doesn't really matter. And for now, we're just gonna put the text in here of currency row so we know this is rendering. So in our app, we can just come up here and say import currency row from, we wanna do it from /currency row. And just like that, if we save, come over to our application over here, and we actually import our currency row by using it. So we just come down here and type currency row. And we want to make sure that since we have 2 elements here, we wrap these inside of fragments. Otherwise, it won't actually render. If I remove this and save, you see we're going to get an error. But if I wrap this in fragments by doing this and indenting this properly, these are just empty elements that allow you to return one thing in JavaScript. And as you can see, now we have convert and currency row. Then between our currency row and convert, we're going to want to have here a div. And inside this div, we're just going to have the equal sign, and then we're going to have another currency row down here. So we have convert, currency row, equal, and then another currency row, which is the same setup that we have over here. Now let's work on styling our currency row so that it actually has the selects box and the input. So inside of our currency row, what we need to do is we're going to have our wrapper div, and inside of that, we're going to want to first have an input, which is going to have a type of number. And this is going to contain our value for our input, and then we're going to have a select. And inside of the select, we're going to have a bunch of different options. For now, I'm just going to put a single option, which has a value of high, and we're just going to give it the text of high as well. And now if we save, go over here, we have that select, which that's single option inside of it, and we have an input where we can type different numbers. So we have all of the base code that we need to start styling our application so that we can make it look like this before we actually go on and make the implementation of our JavaScript so that we can hook up all the interactivity. So the first thing I want to do in our styles is make this centered in the middle of our screen. So we can select our body to do this. And what we want to do is remove all the margins from our body, and we're going to use display flex to line everything up in the center. And to do that, we can just justify and align our items into the center of our screen. And as you can see, it aligned everything horizontally, but to align things vertically, we need to make sure that we set a minimum height to 100 view height. And now if we save, you can see we have everything lined up vertically and horizontally, dead in the center of our screen. Also, we can change our text align to center, and that'll line up our convert and our equal sign text, which is exactly what we want. Now to select that H1, which has our convert text, we're just going to remove our margin from it, so that way everything gets pushed up right next to it, and there's no margin on the top. But we're also going to add in a little bit of margin back onto the bottom. We'll just say 0.5 rem, just to give us a little bit of space between our input and our convert text up here. The next thing we want to do is actually select our input elements. So I'm going to add a class to these. We're just going to give each one a class name, which is going to be input. Now in our CSS, we can select that input and start styling it how we want. First, I want to change our border. We're just going to use a 1 pixel solid border. And we'll just use this 333 color. It's kind of an off gray, like a dark color. Also, we're going to make that border rounded so it looks a little bit better. So we'll do 0.3 em, just like that. As you can see, we get these nice rounded corners. And we'll also add in a little bit of padding, 0.25 rem, and specify an exact width of 7 em. And what that's going to do is make sure that we have a set width because numbers aren't going to get super big when it comes to currency. And it's also giving us a little bit of padding between the edges of our input and our actual numbers, because if we remove that padding, you see it's very squished up together. So this looks much better already. Next thing we want to do is select our select boxes and just give them a little bit of margin on the left, which say 0.5 rem. That looks pretty good. That just spaces our select box out from our input so they're not touching each other, because that doesn't quite look very good. And now lastly, let's go back into our app.js and add a class here. So we'll say class name is going to be equal to equals, and then we can select that in our CSS, just make it quite a bit larger so it's easy to see what this looks like. So we'll give it a font weight of bold, and we're going to give it a font size of 2 rem. As you can see, it just makes our equal sign really stick out, and now our app is styled pretty much exactly the same between both of these different examples, which is exactly what we want. Now that we have all of this styling done, we can completely remove these style sheets, just close it out, and we can start working on actually importing all of our currency codes from the web. And the way we're going to do this is by using an API here called exchangeratesAPI.io. And if we come down, you can see that we have all these different usages here, and the main usage that we want is this very first one, which is going to get us all of the latest currency conversions in JSON format. And if I just copy this right here, this URL, and I can just paste this URL into our app. So we can say const base URL is going to be equal to this URL. So this is going to get us all the latest currency conversions that we want. And then we can actually fetch that API. And we want to fetch this API every time we load our application. So in order to do that, we're going to use an effect. So we can come in here and import useEffect from React, and we can use that useEffect. And what we want to do is first pass it a function. So the very first parameter is a function, and the second parameter is an array. And whenever the items in that array change, we want to rerun this useEffect. And in our case, we only ever want to call this once. So we're going to put an empty array. Since an empty array will never change, this useEffect will only get called the first time our application loads. And then what we want to do is we want to fetch that base URL. And then what we want to do when we get that fetch back, we want to convert our response to JSON. So we'll say res.json, which returns another promise. And this actually has our data. So just for now, I'm going to console.log out this data so we can see what we're getting returned. So if we go over to our application and I inspect our page, you can see if I go to the console, we get an object being returned, which has a rates property. And this is just an object which has individual currencies and the rate of conversion. And then our base, which is what we're converting from. So our base, you can see here is euros. And then we have all of these other different currencies. So the one thing I want to do is populate our list of select options from this list of rates here, also including this base of euros. So in order to do that, what we need to do is set up some state for our application. So we're going to use the useState hook as well. And what we want is we want state for what our currency list is going to be. So this useState function returns an array of options. The first option is going to be what our state is, the actual current iteration of our state. So this is our currency options. And the second value is going to be the object or the function that allows you to set that currency options. So we're going to call this set currency options is equal to useState. And by default, we're just going to pass this an empty array because we don't have any options yet when our application first loads. Now, inside of this function here that we get our data back, we can actually convert this data into an array of options. And that's actually fairly straightforward to do. So we can just call that set currency options function, and we want to pass this an array. The first value in this array is going to be that data.base. And then the next value is going to be all of those keys from the object in that rates part of our data. So we can say data.rates, and we want to get the keys. So we can just say object.keys, and this is going to get us just the key portion of the rates. And all we want to do is destructure this array. So we can just put 3 dots in the front like this. And now what happens is our currency options are going to be set to all of these different values. And what we can do is just console.log our currency options just to see what they look like. And now if we save, inspect our page, you can see the first time we run, we just get an empty array. And the second time we run this, we get a list of all of our different currency options. As you can see, there's 32 of them, 33 of them actually. So we have all of our different currency options inside of our list. And what we want to do is populate those in our currency rows. So let's actually come into our currency row and pass in our currency options as a prop. So just like that, we passed our currency options into our first one. And let's do this in our second row as well. Now each of our rows have currency options passed into them. And inside of here, we are going to take in a variable called props. And what we want to do is destructure that into objects. So our very first object is going to be those currency options. And we're just going to set this equal to props. And if you're confused by any of this destructuring or spread operators, make sure that you check out my destructure and spread video, which is going to be linked in the cards and description below. It's going to clarify all of this for you. So once we have that currency options, we can actually loop through those inside of our select. So we can say currency options dot map, and this is going to translate our array of currency options into actual options, as you can see here. So each one of these is going to be one of our options. And inside of this function, what we want to do is actually return each one of our options. And our value for these options is just going to be this option text. And the value inside of here is also going to be our option itself. And if we save this, you can see our list is now populated with all of those options. But if we inspect, you're going to notice we have an error. If we go to our console, it says each child in the list should have a unique key prop. And since this is a list of objects, we need to make sure each one has a value of key, which we're just going to set to option. This just needs to be a unique value for each one of the children. This way React can efficiently update all of our options when they change. So now if we save and inspect our application, you'll notice we no longer have any errors in here, and just our array of options are being printed out. So let's go back into our app and remove that console.log so we don't actually print out these options anymore. And right now we have a good base point of our app where we have all of our different currencies imported. But we want to have a default currency selected for each one of our inputs. So let's actually come in here and create some more state. This first one is going to be our from currency. This is going to be our first option here. And we also need to have that set from currency variable. And that's going to be useState. And by default, this is just going to be empty. Next, we're going to copy that down and do the exact same thing for our to currency, which is this second select option. And we have to have our set to currency. And then when we get all of our currencies, we want to set our from currency to that base currency. So we'll just say data.base. And then we also want to set our to currency, and we're just going to get the very first option from this array. So in order to do that, let's actually get that first currency by just saying const currency is equal to data.rates. And we want to get the keys. So let's just say object.keys. And we want to get just the very first one in this array. So we'll just say of 0. This will just be whatever the first currency returned is the one that we want to select. So we'll just actually set this to first currency to make the variable better named. Then when we set our currency, we're just going to set it to that first currency. So now we have our from currency and our to currency being set. And if we save, you can see everything is still working. So what we can do is actually pass in our selected currency. And this first one is going to be our from currency. And our second row is going to have our to currency as its selected currency. Now inside of each row, we can get that prop out of our props. So we can say that we want to have our selected currency, just like this. Make sure we spell selected properly. And then we can set the value of our select equal to that selected currency. Now if we save, you can see this didn't actually update. So let's see if we made a mistake. Inside of here, it looks like everything's right. We set our value, selected currency. Let's go to our app, and we can see that this should be selected currency, not select currency. So let's just update that naming, save again, and you can see that here we have Europe being selected since it's our base value. And then here we just have the first option after Europe being selected by default, which is great. We have all of our select option stuff done. But what about when we update it? What happens if we update this to CZK? When we click, you see nothing happens. And that's because we need to hook up an onChange event for each one of our different currency selectors. So let's do that now. Inside of our currency row, we want to select an onChange event. And inside of here is where we're going to push a function. And we're going to take that function from our props. This function is just going to be called onChangeCurrency. And we're going to pass that function to our onChange. So every time this value is changed, it's going to call this onChangeCurrency function, which we're actually passing in from our app. So we can say onChangeCurrency is going to be equal to a function, and this function is going to get the event from our select here, and it's just going to be an inline function where we're going to set our here to currency to our event.target. This is just going to be our select, and we want to get the value of that select. Let's do the same thing up here, where we're going to set our from currency, and now when we save, when we update our European currency to a different one, you can see it properly updates, and it does it for both of our different options. And the reason this works is because in our currency row, we're hooking up our onChange event to this onChangeCurrency function. We're passing that in from our app, and then we're actually setting the from currency, which is from our state up here, and we're passing in that e.target.value, which is whatever the value of our select option is. Now that we have our selects all set up, we can select and change all we want. Let's move on to setting up our different amounts. So we're going to have another state, which is going to be our amount. So our amount, and we're going to have a set amount. We're just going to set this equal to useState, and by default, we'll make our amount 1. And since we're actually allowing two-way changes, for example, we could type in an amount in the European version or in the Canadian version, this amount variable is just going to be set to whichever one of these we change. And then we also need a separate variable to denote if we changed from the to currency or the from currency. So if we change this first value or the second value. So let's create another variable, and this is going to be called amount in from currency, currency. And we want to be able to set our amount in from currency. And by default, we're going to set this to true. So we can just say useState of true. And what this variable is telling us is it's saying, is our amount that we changed in this first box our from currency, or is it our second box down here, which is our to currency? This will just let us know which one we need to update. And then instead of our useEffect, we also need to make sure we get the exchange rate. So instead of here, we can say const exchange rate, and set exchange rate is going to be equal to useState. And by default, again, this does not have a value. But inside of here, we can set our exchange rate, which is just equal to our data.rates. We want to get the very first object, which is going to be our first currency. And this is going to be the actual rate for our currency. And we can just log this out for now so we can see how this works. So console.log exchange rate. And now if we inspect our page, you can see in our console, at the beginning we get undefined, but then we get our exchange rate from European to Canadian dollars, which is 1.4604, which is exactly what we want. Now the next thing we need to do is we can use our exchange rate, our amount, and our variable that tells us if we change the to or from currency to actually get the amount in the to box right here and the amount in the from box. So let's create some variables, which is going to be to amount and from amount. This is just for our two different boxes. And then to figure out which variable is set to what value, we can just have an if check here for amount in from currency. So if this is true, then it means our amount that we have in our state is our from amount. So we can set our from amount to our amount. And then our to amount is going to be equal to our amount times the exchange rate. Just like that. So now we have our from amount and our to amount set. But if it's the opposite way, so our amount is in the to currency, we can just say our to amount is equal to amount, and then our from amount is going to be equal to the amount divided by the exchange rate. And this is just because our exchange rate is always from our to amount to our from amount. So to reverse that, we want to just make sure we divide by our exchange rate. Now we can pass these amounts to our currency row. So we can say our first one is our from amount, and our second one is going to be our to amount, just like that. And then in the row, let's just put that inside of our input as the value. So we'll say value is equal to amount, and let's get that from our props. Now when we save, you can see this very first value has an 1, and the second one is 1.4604. So we properly have our conversion taking place, which is exactly what we want. Now we need to make it so that we can actually update these inputs. As you can see, I can type all I want, but these inputs don't change. We need another onChange event. So let's do an onChange. And we want to do this as an onChange amount, which we're going to get in here from the props. So onChange amount, just like that. And this is going to work very similar to how we did our onChange currency. So we can say onChange amount, but this time we're actually going to set it to a variable, which is handle from amount change, just like that. So let's create that function, which is handle from amount change. And inside of here, we are going to get that e variable, so we can actually get the amount. So we can set our amount is equal to e.target.value. And we also want to set our amount in from currency to be true, because we changed our from amount, so we wanted to note that this amount is from the from currency. We're going to do the exact same thing, but for handling our to amount change, but we want to set this variable here to false, since we're changing our to amount and not our from amount. And then inside of here, we can just copy down this onChange amount down here, but we want to handle our to amount change, just like that. And now what's going to happen is if I update this value, you can see down here, our conversion continues to take place. But if I update this bottom value, it'll update our top value. And that's because of these variables here with the true false. It's telling us which box we're actually changing so that we know how to do our conversion from the amount and which values to set properly. It's fairly confusing, but hopefully this explanation I gave made at least a little bit of sense. Now the next thing we have to do is to allow us to change currencies, because when we change currencies, our conversion does not actually update. And in order to do that, we need another useEffect. So let's just create our useEffect. And inside of this useEffect, what we need to do is we need to call this function, and we want to call it anytime one of our currency changes. So when our from currency or our to currency changes, so if this array ever changes, which means our from or to currency changed, we're going to run the code inside of this function. So inside of this function, we're going to do another fetch request. And this time we're going to fetch from our base URL. So let's get our base URL. And this, we can pass in the parameters of base to equal something, which is going to be here. And we can also pass in a value of symbol, just like that, symbols. And this is also going to equal something. And the way that this works in the API that we're using is this base value is going to be our from currency. So in our case, our from currency, we're saying where are we converting from? And symbols is all the values we want to convert to, which is going to be our to currency. Then what we can do is just call our .then. So we can say .then, we're going to get back a response, and we want to convert that response to JSON. And then we're going to get back some data. So we can say .then of our data. And this data is going to be the same data that we had up here, but it's just going to have one single value in our array of rates. So we can say data.rates, and we want to get the rate for our to currency. And we're just going to set our exchange rate equal to that new exchange rate. So now when we update our currencies, we're going to essentially go to this API and get the new exchange rate for our conversion between these two different currencies. And immediately after I save this, you'll notice we have an error over here. It's saying cannot read undefined of undefined. And that's because what's happening is this useEffect is being called when from and to currency are actually completely undefined. So we want to just make sure that our from currency right here and our to currency are actually values. So we can say from currency is not equal to null and our to currency is not equal to null. Then we want to run the code inside of this fetch. So let's just pull this all the way up here inside of this if statement. And now when I save, you can see that that error goes away. And if we change this to, for example, a different currency, you can see it updates our currencies as you would expect. We can also change this currency down here and it's going to update everything just like we would expect. And with that, we're finished with our currency converter. But if you're interested in learning more about React in depth, everything you need to know, I have an entire course on React called Learn React Today, which I will have linked in the description of this video for you to check out. It's an amazing course that covers every single thing you need to know about modern React and will get you up and running incredibly quickly. So I highly recommend you check it out if you enjoyed this video. And with that out of the way, you can check out some of my other videos linked over here and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.